And I am very happy that I have this opportunity to share my research with you today. So what I will speak about is welfare dictatorships. And I want to start off by talking about dictatorships more generally. So if we look at the average longevity of dictatorships, we notice that there is great variability in how long they last. And most dictatorships are fairly short-lasting, especially if they don't have any political parties. But dictatorships that have political parties tend to last longer. And in fact, there is a subtype of dictatorships that lasts considerably longer than any other type of dictatorship, and this is the single-party communist regime. So most of what I will talk about today is communist regimes and the conditions under which communist regimes might be able to become what I call welfare dictatorships. Now, we have an extensive literature on dictatorships, and most of that literature does not focus on welfare as a strategy for maintaining authoritarian resilience. These standard arguments have focused, going back to Brzezinski and Friedrich, they have focused on rewarding elites and repressing the masses. The argument has been that even if dictators are interested in catering to welfare needs, they would not be able to do so because in autocracies there is the widespread, ubiquitous preference falsification. People don't tell you what they think, thus making it very difficult to assess their welfare needs. There is a strand in the literature, a fairly new strand in the literature that has focused on welfare, but it has done so for the case of Mexico and other electoral autocracies, and the argument has been that during electoral cycles, autocrats might need to cater to the needs of ordinary citizens. But in these mainstream studies of authoritarian resilience, the emphasis has been on suppressing the masses and rewarding elites, and not on welfare. So what I'm arguing today, borrowing a term from Jarasch, who has written about Fürsorge Diktaturen, I'm arguing that some communist autocracies can, under certain conditions, develop into welfare dictatorships. When this happens, if this happens, the main strategy for regime survival is not repression, but it is the use of high levels of spending on social security, housing, and consumer goods subsidies, which are consistent with popular redistributive preferences. So welfare dictatorships are softer types of dictatorships than the standard communist dictatorship that has been described by Brzezinski and Friedrich. So if we accept this concept of welfare dictatorships, and depending on the audience that I have spoken to, I've had great opposition to the concept itself, so if we were willing to accept the concept, then we have several puzzles. Namely, the puzzles that I will engage with today are: when do these welfare dictatorships emerge in the life cycle of dictatorships? How do they operate? And under what conditions might they break down? My argument is that by engaging with this set of questions, we can get deeper into the political logic of redistribution, both in centrally planned economies, which are the locus classicus for these welfare dictatorships, but also in more recent types of market-oriented dictatorships. Now, fortunately, there is a strand of literature, I wouldn't call it the mainstream literature, but I'm not the first person, obviously, to think about welfare and dictatorships. So there are fascinating studies by historians, which are in the first bullet points. These are histories of socialist consumption in Eastern Europe. One of them, at least, has been done by somebody in Finland, Granma, so that's the second person on that first bullet point. And then political scientists, going back to the 1980s, have been arguing that there is a socialist social contract in the Soviet Union. This research was received with a lot of hostility at the time that it was published, and there was certainly the question whether you can prove, the question was being asked of these political scientists, whether they can prove that such a thing existed in communist regimes. So what I'm arguing is that these studies by political scientists were done without the possibility of access to primary sources that might prove that such social contracts existed. And today we have access to these types of materials. So what I'm aiming to do is I'm aiming to connect the different strands of the literature on autocracies and to argue that when we have access to internal documents on the operation of authoritarian regimes, we can demonstrate that autocrats are concerned both with elites and with the masses, and this emphasis on the masses is relatively new, I think, in the literature. And specifically the questions that I engage with is, if welfare dictatorships existed, where did they exist, and did they persist after 1989? So I think most of the scholars who have written about this topic assume that welfare dictatorships died with the death of communism in Eastern Europe, and what I would argue today is that they, in fact, have survived under certain conditions after 89. So what I'm speaking about today is based in part on this book, which exists in the library, although I have briefly borrowed the library copy, and I will give it back to Marco right after this talk. So this is a book that I published last year in Bulgarian. For those of you who may not speak Bulgarian, the English title is The Political Logic of Socialist Consumption. And what I'm doing now is I'm expanding this book for an English language publisher with a lot more cases and a lot less emphasis on the Bulgarian case. So the argument in brief, I'm linking welfare and information. I argue that information provides a lens for understanding the emergence, operation, and demise of welfare dictatorships. The emergence of these welfare dictatorships is spurred by the lack of information. This is information of a particular kind. This is information about the redistributive preferences of the population. The operation of these dictatorships is premised on the presence of abundant information. Again, information of a certain kind, information about the welfare needs and redistributive preferences of the population. This is information that is normally transmitted through complaints, but as I would argue towards the end of the talk, protests can also have that function. And then the demise of these dictatorships occurs despite the presence of abundant information. So here I differ from the standard understandings of communist collapse, which focus on the lack of information. I argue that when these regimes collapse, they have plentiful information, but they're unable to deliver on their social contract commitments to the population. So the social contract, something that Linda Cook, who has had a long time association with this institute, among others, has argued about, provides the mechanism that enforces the bargain between the regime and the masses. And the argument is that the masses will stay quiescent for as long as the regime satisfies their redistributive preferences. So, information. Welfare dictatorships emerge following unanticipated eruptions of system destabilizing discontent. The operation requires the collection of information on redistributive preferences, and the failure of these dictatorships occurs under conditions of economic scarcity, but with abundant information on popular preferences. So this is in a nutshell what I will try to convince you of in the next 30 minutes or so. So what I will do before I get into specific cases, I will briefly talk about the general problem of theory generation in the study of autocracies. Where do theories come from? Then I will talk about welfare dictatorships under central planning before '89. Then I will talk about a centrally planned economy that continues to exist today. That's Cuba. It's a very unusual and interesting case of an ongoing welfare dictatorship. I will then talk about China. I will very briefly extend to Russia by just showing 2 slides, and then I will conclude. So we have a lot of cases. Now, in terms of where theory might come from, we have as scholars 2 options. One is to focus on public artifacts, documents that circulate in the open, that are produced for open circulation. And then there's an alternative, which is to focus on documents that are produced for regime insiders. So these are documents that at the moment when they were produced were not meant for public dissemination. So the bulk of this project is focused on acquiring and then analyzing these types of materials, internal documents produced for Communist Party officials. And I have listed the main types of materials on which this project is based and the places from where they come. Here are some examples. This is a document that was produced following the Novocherkassk riots in 1962 in the Soviet Union. These were riots about increases in meat prices and work norms, among others, that put the Politburo into a panic. This is a document from the Bulgarian archives about citizen complaints. This has an EHA, which is Erich Honecker, document about citizen complaints in East Germany. And there's some examples from the Chinese archives of a situation report from Shanghai about citizen discontent. And then the marginalia, quite interesting, in terms of reaction of decision makers. So let me get to my cases. And the first question that I want to engage with is the origins of these welfare dictatorships. June 1953 in Berlin is remembered as the month of the worker uprising. As this photo and the placard that these workers are carrying indicates, is they wanted a limiting of the norms or reduction of the work norms. So the uprising emerged because work norms will increase. However, the other thing that happened is that there was a scarcity of various basic food items in the German Democratic Republic at the time. Potatoes, lard, sugar, and most important of all, meat. In addition to increasing the work norms, the prices of basic food items were raised. So these workers were protesting against this double whammy of having to work more for less. Now, this 1953 worker uprising put the East German State Security Service, the Stasi, into a panic because it was unanticipated. And the question was, what could they do? Well, of course, they used the assistance of the Soviet troops to put down the uprising, but in the wake of the June 53 worker uprising in Berlin, there was a very systematic effort to collect information on popular discontent while it was still in its latent or unexpressed form. So the idea was, we need to be able to assess discontent before workers get into the street, and we need to be able to give them what they need, in particular meat and food at low prices. So over time, what East Germany did is it developed a number of different channels for the collection of information on discontent. And I've listed the main channels on this slide. So the general conclusion that one draws from examining the types of materials that were produced through these channels that were circulated to the leadership is that abundant information was available. I have conducted some research in the Bulgarian archives and have written of various aspects of the Bulgarian communist regimes. So what we can say is that East Germany is not an isolated case. There's similar dynamics in Bulgaria in terms of developing these techniques for collection of information on popular discontent. Bulgaria had its own protests in 1953. These are not widely known in the literature. They preceded these German protests by a few weeks, in fact, and they were by tobacco workers in the south of the country and textile workers in another city. But of course, protests elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc were also hugely consequential for the Bulgarian leadership in terms of impressing upon it the importance of popular discontent and of assessing this popular discontent prior to its eruption into overt system destabilizing protests. So Bulgaria developed its techniques for collecting information. Again, I've listed the main channels on this slide. Now, I'm fascinated with complaints, both because, well, this perhaps would reveal too much. I mean, I think, if you complain, it tends to work usually, right? And there are a lot of things to complain about. But I'm fascinated with complaints in an academic sense as well. And what is interesting to me is that communist leaders paid attention to these complaints. And complaints were, in fact, mostly about consumption matters under communism. And so when you have a large enough volume of complaints that can be collected and then analyzed, they can yield very important information about the distribution of popular preferences about various types of welfare. So most complaints were about problems with housing, job assignment, and various types of shortages, also the quality of services. Now, what is important about complaints is that they can also serve as a bellwether of popular willingness to participate in the system. And contrary to what our intuitive understanding of transient complaints might be, that communist leaders were concerned about more complaints, in fact, the opposite is true. So a sharp drop in the volume of complaints under worsening economic conditions sent a negative signal to leadership. And the signal was, things are objectively getting worse, people are unwilling to complain, which means that they no longer are willing to participate in the system and they no longer trust us to be able to resolve their grievances. So this is precisely what happened in the case of Bulgaria, but it also happens in other regimes. So I'll just limit myself to the Bulgarian case for now. So there were various indicators that this welfare dictatorship was entering a period of crisis. And these indicators were being transmitted to the leadership years before 1989. One of the most important one of the most important indicators is on the previous slide. This is this decline in complaints. The situation is getting worse, people complain less. But then there were other types of indicators that this incapacity of the regime to satisfy the welfare preferences of the population was helping to transform latent discontent into overt discontent. So leaders in Eastern Europe were warned of what was coming their way, and then these welfare dictatorships collapsed. But they collapsed there. So I'm going to shift to a different continent, and I'll present you with a few slides about a case that is not commonly looked at, but I think it's fascinating. And it's fascinating because I took this image earlier this summer. So I was in Cuba in May for, I guess, as in Finland, it would have been my 4th or 5th visit to the island, and I was doing some research. So what this is this is a board of the monthly rations of individuals living in a central part of Havana. And it tells them what they can get with their so-called supplies booklet, or libreta de abastecimientos. What they get is at hugely subsidized prices, so they spend about $2 a month to get their monthly supply of eggs, poultry, flour, pasta, and a few other items, sugar, of course, this being Cuba. So rationing persists as of 2019 in Cuba. What's interesting for me is how this rationing occurred, or how it originated. So you might wonder why I'm showing you this tank. I'm showing you this tank because this is at a museum on the beach, the Bay of Pigs, or Playa Girón, as the Cubans call it. So the libretas de abastecimientos, these supplies booklets, were introduced just 1 year after the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was a period of extreme fragility for the regime. So in the case of Cuba, it didn't take a mass uprising in order to start catering to the consumption preferences of the population, but it did take an attempted foreign invasion. So there are two different models in which these welfare dictatorships can emerge. What is important is that in the Cuban case, this regime still persists, and it's still nearly 60 years after this invasion continues to provide goods at rationed prices. So when I go to Cuba, I'm interested in these letters to the editor, or cartas de la dirección, which are published in Granma, in the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, every Friday. And this gives you, they started being published once a week 10 years ago, in 2008. So this gives you a sense of the number of letters, responses, and then editorial postscripts on unsatisfactory letters. And if you're interested in exploring this further, I have an article that came out in the Latin American Research Review earlier this year on this issue. So this is what the letters look like. This is just one random page of Granma. And what is most important to me is that very quickly there was a massive reduction in the proportion of letters that were praising the party and the revolution that were published in Granma, and there was an increase in the letters about shortages and the poor quality of goods and services. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of these letters concern shortages and the poor supply of goods and services. These are real problems in the case of Cuba. So what I was interested in thinking about in reading and analyzing these letters is what is the function of published letters to the editor in the 2010s. I mean, we know from Aleksanteri and his work on Soviet letters of complaint in the 1950s that, you know, these things existed in Eastern Europe, but at a different age. So this is somewhat anachronistic, you know, in the current day and age, published letters to the editor. So I argue that they allow the Cuban Communist Party to signal its openness to criticism, they reduce social tension through the horizontal transmission of information about daily life problems, and they demonstrate accountability through the responses that Granma encourages to these letters. And they help keep this social contract operating. The regime cares about popular needs, is what these letters are telling people. So they're placed there for a reason, and if there's interest, we could perhaps talk in the Q&A about the logic of publishing certain things and not publishing others. But I need to proceed. I need to go to China, and then I have promised that we'll go to Russia before we conclude. So I have just a couple more slides on the Cuban case. So a wealthy dictatorship persists in the case of Cuba because rationing survives almost 60 years after it was introduced. There's still massively subsidized housing and utilities. A couple of dollars a month help Cubans pay for their gas, electricity, telephone, and their monthly rent. Healthcare is free, as is education. Cuba, however, did raise its retirement age to 6 years for women and 65 for men. China is the only one of the communist regimes that has kept its originally low retirement age. So blue-collar female workers can retire at the age of 50 in China. The regular retirement age is 55. And men, blue-collar workers, retire at 55 and otherwise at 60. There have been discussions for a very long time that perhaps this retirement age should be raised, but for political reasons, given the sensitivity of this issue, it has not yet been done in China. Cuba managed to do it. However, other aspects of the socialist welfare state persist, so state employment still dominates overwhelmingly. Private sector employment, nearly 30 years after the initial changes away from central planning in Cuba, only makes up 21% of employment in Cuba. And the argument, you know, because oftentimes there are these interests, there's this interest whether China and Cuba are following parallel paths. At least in terms of agricultural reform, it is very unlikely that Cuba would be using a Chinese-style sequencing of reform. And the reason for that is that the majority of its arable land, the Cuban arable land, lies fallow. So the most recent statistics I have are from 2017 that indicate that over 50% of agricultural land in Cuba lies fallow. Foreign direct investment, in contrast to China, is highly limited, so Cuba survives on foreign tourism. It received almost 5 million tourists with a population of 10 million last year, and it has foreign remittances. So, Cuban Revolution is being safeguarded. Okay, we need to move to China. So, China presents us with a different model of a welfare state from the one that existed in Eastern Europe. So in recent years, I've been obsessed, that would be the right word, with this particular document. So this is a daily intelligence brief prepared for members of the Central Committee in China, and it is available in one place in the world for the first 16 years of the existence of the Chinese Communist regime, from December 22nd, 1949 until from September 22nd, 1949 until December 29th, 1964. So it allows us to see what leaders read about, and it also allows us, given my interest today in welfare dictatorships, to ask the question, what did they read about the welfare needs of their citizens in that early period? And so when you analyze the content of this daily intelligence brief, you see that a number of sensitive items were covered in this bulletin in those 16 years for which we have access to it, including famine, right? So there is this argument in the China field that Mao knew nothing about the 1958, 9, and 1960 famine during the Great Leap Forward. Well, there were famine reports in this source, which he read, and of course he had access to other materials as well. So in fact, there were different kinds of famines. So what we have in Chinese is the different words for spring famine, spring hunger, summer hunger, and then famine. So there were reports about all these matters, but my argument about this particular source is that the reports were highly specific. They were about a single geographic location, and there were next to no nationally comprehensive reports in this source. So as a result, information gathering in those early years was locally specific. It was not systematic and nationwide. So I am, in fact, willing to side with those who argue that whatever information Chairman Mao had during the Great Leap Forward, it was not nationally comprehensive. So he could get into the arguments that yes, there's hunger in some provinces, but not in others, which in fact was true. The problem was that the leadership didn't quite know how many provinces had hunger and how many didn't. Now, going into the issue of welfare dictatorship, one of the arguments that I'm making in this project is that in order to construct a welfare dictatorship, you need to have systematic nationwide collection of information about the redistributive preferences of the population. This is not something that the Chinese regime was able to do under Mao. And there was no welfare dictatorship in China in the 1950s. So Shanghai is always the example as the most developed part of China during that period. Shanghai even had very limited welfare provision. Welfare was supplied to 51% of the workforce, which at that point in time constituted only 21% of the population of Shanghai. And then in other cities there was significantly lower provision and there was nothing in the countryside. Also importantly, in contrast to Eastern Europe at the time, there was no expectation of universal welfare provision under Mao. And information gathering was rudimentary, and it focused on instances of overt discontent. There was no capacity to systematically monitor latent discontent. Then I argue this changes everything. And so this is Tiananmen 89, and Tiananmen 89 is justly remembered as a case where students protest against the ossification of the Chinese Communist Party. But there is another side to Tiananmen. And this other side is both literal and figurative. So the other side to Tiananmen is the worker protests. And the workers were protesting on a different side of the square from the students. The students didn't want to mix with the workers because they felt that their demands were very different. What the students wanted was Chinese-style democracy and greater accountability of the Chinese Communist Party. What the workers wanted is the law that allowed enterprise bankruptcy to not be enforced. They were protesting against high level of inflation, and they were protesting because there was the prospect, at least legally, of unemployment. So the Chinese government, in the lead up to Tiananmen, was trying to reform the centrally planned economy, and these reform efforts met with overt and very strong opposition by workers. So these urban reforms of the highly inefficient state-owned enterprises were delayed by almost a decade as a consequence of Tiananmen. And so in the Chinese case, we have a very curious model of welfare being created after '89. In terms of the mechanisms through which this was made possible, it is, again, through petitions, transmission of information, as in Eastern Europe. So petitions are a very important source of information, not only in the East European context, but also in the case of China. Now, what is important to me is that petitioning is declining in the Chinese case. And this, as in the context of Eastern Europe, is sending a signal. The signal is that this channel is not working. Citizens are unwilling to petition because they do not believe that their concerns will be effectively communicated to leaders, and petitioning would be a successful channel for getting redress. So petitioning is declining, but at the same time mass incidents, which is another word for protests, are increasing. So in the last couple of years, I've been focusing on protests in China. And the reason for that is that those two individuals, before they were arrested in 2016, were doing the great public service of crowdsourcing information about protests in China. So protest data became highly sensitive and classified about 15 years ago in China. So it is very difficult to get data on protests. Liu Yu and his girlfriend Li Tingyu were collecting these data, and they were putting them on the internet. And then on June 16th, 2016, they were arrested. So the data stops, and the data is from fall of 2013 through the spring of 2016. It's about 65,000 protests. So one of my doctoral students at Tulane, Zhu Zhang, and I analyzed the data. This is a map of the protests in 2014 geographically, right? So we know that most protests tend to be in the south. So we're consistent with that. But we subjected a subset of the protests. These are the large protests. And in 2014, there were about 1,000 such protests. We subjected them to more detailed coding than the rest of the protests, in part because we had better data for the large protests. Our event descriptions were longer. So what is relevant for this talk today is that most of these protests are about issues that we can broadly describe as welfare related. So certainly wages and social security payments are part of welfare, as is unemployment, living condition, and education. So forced seizure of land, that would take some explaining. Demolition of housing is certainly within the realm of welfare. So what we are arguing is that most of these concerns that are articulated through protests, at least based on our data set, are about welfare today. What is problematic, though, is what type of response these protests receive. And I have highlighted what I think is most alarming about this response, and what's most alarming is the 1% negotiation and persuasion as the end result of these protests. So in most cases what we have is the police is either present at the protest or it engages in overtly repressive tactics such as expulsion of protests, repression and arrest, and confrontation with protesters. So the question then is, what kinds of thoughts do these results lead us to? And the thoughts are not very optimistic. So the general conclusions from this protest data set are that protests today, at least the large protests that we could code in a more detailed way, are about socioeconomic rights that form part of the post-Tenement social contract. Welfare considerations are still very important in contemporary China. They're just not expressed through petitions. They're more likely to be expressed through protests. What is also important is that police response is very firm, even if violence is not the modal response. Violence is more likely to occur in rural protests over land. Urban protests are about wages and social security. They're less likely to become violent, but the police is still present. So this is sending a signal to the protesters. And the signal is that their concerns are not welcomed by the authorities. So thus far, the situation has not exploded, but there's no guarantee that it will remain manageable. So the one part of this protest activity that is beneficial to the central government is that in contrast to protests in Eastern Europe, where when citizens protested, they always protested against the central government, right? They protested in opposition to the central government. In the Chinese case, because of the massive decentralization that has taken place, since the late 1970s. These protests are directed against the local government, and the central government still manages to appear as an ally of the protesters. So the welfare dictatorship is in crisis, but the protests are not necessarily directed against the central government itself. So, in the interest of time, I will move on to another case, and then I will conclude. So, the question is, do we have leftovers of welfare dictatorships today, however we want to think of them, regimes that have a history of being welfare dictatorships, so these are contemporary manifestations, the last gasps of welfare. So in some work that I did with Linda Cook, we argued that, in fact, we can think of the social contract under market settings. We can think of the reasons why certain aspects of communist welfare were preserved for as long as they were in Russia. And I think the protests that occurred last year help with these types of arguments. So Russians want to be able to live long enough so that they can get retired and not die on the job. So after keeping the Soviet retirement age for nearly 30 years, the retirement age was eventually raised. Initially, the plan was to raise it to 65 years for men and 63 for women, but this would make Russians into skeletons. So after much opposition and dealing disastrously, dealing not very well in the local elections in the fall of 2018, and after suffering a dip to his popularity, Putin agreed to lower the retirement age for women to 60 from the initial plan of 63, and men, if they're fortunate enough to live to 65, get to retire at 65. This is, I think, an interesting case to think about some surviving aspects of welfare expectations, even outside of the setting of a communist regime. So, summing up this argument about welfare dictatorships, I have argued that welfare dictatorships featuring low levels of repression and high levels of social spending and price subsidies can emerge either following internal shocks, as in Eastern Europe, or following an external shock, as in the case of Cuba. Their successful operation depends on access to resources and to information about the redistributive preferences of the population. External shocks can lead to the failure of social contracts, as they did in '89 in Eastern Europe. But we have the example of Cuba, where despite an external shock, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the social contract persists nearly 3 decades later. So welfare dictatorships can, in fact, persist to the current day. So there's the case of Cuba, and then the very different case of China, where the government feels that it needs to guarantee certain types of welfare for its citizens, and welfare preferences continue to matter, and we can discuss how much they matter, in a liberal autocracies such as Russia. So a lot of cases, and hopefully a lot of food for questions that we can engage with. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.